Hi everybody, I'm Ezra, cannabis consultant, author of Cannabis Consulting, and you can find me on ezrahelps.com. So today I'm talking about what law enforcement should know about the evolving cannabis laws in states across the country. First of all, I just want to say to people that it's really important that we have a healthy relationship with law enforcement. Whether we're in the cannabis industry or whether we are law enforcement, these laws and the information and data and facts around cannabis are evolving and changing. And a lot of it has to do with perception, with stereotypes, and it's important that both the cannabis industry knows that the law enforcement has to uphold the law and has to manage enforcing laws while these layers of policy are going on in both on the federal level and the state level. So we want to respect law enforcement. We want to make sure that the cannabis industry is doing everything it can to educate law enforcement and to work with them. But it's also important because I work with a lot of individuals, I work with families, and I work with patients. It's important that law enforcement and police officers also understand some basic facts about cannabis and how the evolving laws and the evolving interest and knowledge around cannabis and use of cannabis can make enforcement a little complicated. So I serve as an expert witness on cannabis cases, and often I'm in the state of Massachusetts where we can possess cannabis, we can grow our own cannabis, and we can buy it, purchase it as medical patients, if we're licensed medical patients. So the laws here are pretty liberal. A lot fewer people are getting arrested. Certainly people are not getting arrested for growing cannabis unless they're growing over the amount. And law enforcement is doing pretty good. So you can do 6 plants. And people often, if police are going into a residence and they're finding 10 plants or 15 plants, for example, they're being pretty, they're using their discretion in terms of assessing whether this person is really breaking the law or they just had a few extra plants and not a big deal, and they may remove those extra plants and then leave the patient with, or the adult with just the allowed amount, which I think is a very reasonable approach to law enforcement. But in other states, specifically Connecticut, and I'm sure states across the country, we have these evolving cannabis laws and patient needs and patients using cannabis for different things, and there's disparities. So first of all, I want to talk about possession with intent to sell. So this is a very common charge for people who have cannabis. For example, people get pulled over. They may, if they're in Connecticut, if the police officer smells the odor of cannabis, then they believe that gives them the right to search the car. They have a probable cause. In the state of Massachusetts, that has been determined to not be proper probable cause, because just smelling cannabis doesn't mean that person is impaired, doesn't mean that that person is in possession of cannabis. You could work at a legal cannabis facility and drive home from work perfectly sober, smelling of cannabis, but that does not give police officers in the state of Massachusetts the right to search that operator's vehicle. But in Connecticut, they are still allowed to search in that case. So what happens is a police officer might find 3 jars of cannabis or might find multiple vape pens. So it's important that law enforcement uses discretion when determining whether someone is actually in violation of that law and is intending to sell it, or if they're just possessing their normal amount. So in Connecticut, it's decriminalized up to a half ounce of cannabis. But for example, I could go to a dispensary in Connecticut. I could legally purchase a half ounce of cannabis as a patient, or even just be an adult without a medical license in Connecticut and have in possession a half ounce of cannabis. I could then, at home, very simply, process that cannabis into, say, 3 grams of cannabis oil, hash oil, RSO, various names for it, but it's basically concentrated cannabis extract. And then I could take that cannabis oil and dilute it with a substance that's completely legal, like coconut oil, for example. And then I could put that oil, say I diluted 3 to 5 grams of cannabis into a half cup of cannabis, of MCT or coconut oil. And that oil then gets poured into multiple vape pens. And say you want to take your half ounce of cannabis that you produced, you want to pour it, you want to dilute it with the coconut oil, and then you put it into 5 vape pens that you use at a certain concentration, 5 other vape pens that you use at a different concentration. Maybe one is for daytime use, one is for evening use, etc. Then what happens is you have 10 vape cartridges, or you have 10 different products. And as far as the police are concerned, they look at that and they think, well, you have 10 of these vape cartridges, that's 9 too many, and so therefore we think that you're intending to sell your cannabis. Well, if that person is in possession of a half ounce of cannabis, that's decriminalized. If they process it themselves on their own, they're not necessarily running a drug factory. This is another charge that gets called out in drug cases in Connecticut, is people get charged with possession with intent to sell and running a drug factory. So just because you're taking the cannabis plant and you're processing it in your kitchen, that's what we do with products. You can, if you take a bottle of vodka and then you make Jello shots with it, you're processing that alcohol in your kitchen. And but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be selling those shots of vodka. It's the same with cannabis. And the difference between an individual who is under the decriminalized amount in terms of possession of cannabis, and then gets charged with intent to sell, that's a felony in Connecticut. So that is a possible jail sentence. Police should use discretion in determining whether that person is truly selling something or whether they're just processing the cannabis product into something that they want to use for personal use. So cultivation is another aspect where in Massachusetts we're allowed to cultivate. All over the country now laws are evolving, and there are states where people can legally cultivate marijuana. What happens when you have marijuana plants growing in your home? And you're a patient, for example, you start to explore and experiment with different forms of cannabis and how it might help you. So the cannabis plant is full of dozens of different chemical compounds that interact with our endocannabinoid system, the natural system in our body that receives cannabinoids. And each cannabinoid has different effects. So if you have a raw cannabis plant, you can take the raw leaf from that plant, the raw bud from that plant, and juice it. You can create a liquid that is never heating the plant. This is actually a less psychoactive type of plant. Many people, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that these people who are taking in raw cannabis are getting a wider spectrum of benefits. They're getting more options in terms of symptom relief using raw plant. And there have been cases where people are producing raw plant in large quantities because they like to juice it, and they're going over their limit, but that's what they need as individuals. I know I have a client or a colleague who goes through about 2 pounds of raw cannabis leaf and product from the plant every week. So if you can imagine 2 pounds of cannabis a week, if you're law enforcement, you think that's clearly someone running a drug factory, that's clearly someone who's going to sell that cannabis. Well, if you are part of the medical marijuana patient community, you may realize that that's actually very common, that people are going to have a need for a much larger quantity of cannabis for their own personal use. So in the state of Connecticut, it is illegal to cultivate marijuana, but it's also not available at the dispensaries. You can't go to a dispensary and get raw leaf. It is not a very marketable product. It doesn't get you high, and probably less than 5% of any of the customers at a dispensary may utilize this product. So I've been working on cases in Connecticut where people get caught cultivating. This is a felony in Connecticut. This can cause a person to have federal jail time. So, but maybe raw cannabis is something that really helps them. So a police officer, law enforcement, I believe that law enforcement needs better training about recognizing the difference between what constitutes a cultivation site in someone's residence that might be a drug factory, an actual drug factory that's producing market value cannabis versus producing just raw cannabis for someone's inflammation, where the activated cannabis is not serving their needs. There are a lot of cannabis patients who do not want to get the activated effect. They do not want to be high or stoned. So consuming raw cannabis from their personal grow is an option for them that the law does not encompass in many states. So it's important for law enforcement to recognize that you are altering the course of this person's life by grouping them into a category of a drug dealer, a drug factory, etc. Also, when we talk about the various products, paraphernalia, and tools that people use, often patients, for utilizing their cannabis, for processing it, breaking it down, turning it into different products. Two of the main things I see in drug cases are the use of grinders. So this is a tool where you put cannabis flower, dried cannabis flower into the grinder. You grind it up into loose cannabis product that you may roll into a joint, for example. Now, often grinders are what police consider to be something that drug dealers use to then, to grind the cannabis up, fill joints, and then sell the joints. Well, most personal use cannabis users are using grinders if they're breaking it up. There's not a lot of market value in broken up or grinded cannabis. So very rarely is a drug dealer going to be grinding their own cannabis. In fact, I would say a grinder is more evidence of personal use than any kind of intent to sell, because we purchase cannabis, whether it's on the licit or illicit market, and then we grind that cannabis up for our own personal use. So a grinder is to me, as an expert witness, a sign of a tool that one might use as an individual and not for intent to sell. Another product is a scale. Often I will see scale, kitchen scale, as evidence that the defendant is weighing their cannabis and therefore selling weighed amounts of cannabis. Well, because the black market has been around for over 3 generations, a lot of people who have been using cannabis for years, decades, are getting it on the black market. And they don't want to get ripped off. They want to weigh their cannabis. Some people weigh their cannabis because they want to take a proper dose. They may take a gram a day, for example. They may take 7 grams of cannabis out of a larger amount of cannabis that they weigh and put into a jar, and then they seal away the excess cannabis so that it doesn't go bad, doesn't dry out, where its potency isn't lost. So a scale is another personal use item that's very common in the cannabis world that law enforcement often automatically assumes is related to selling drugs or intent to sell. So that's important that as we learn about evolving use, evolving culture where the sort of underground hidden culture is coming above ground, a lot of people, it's very common to carry a scale, to carry a grinder, and have their personal possession of marijuana without any kind of intent to sell, any kind of nefarious or illegal activity outside of their personal use. Another aspect which I think is really important when we're talking about law enforcement and their use of discretion around cannabis is that when we legalize cannabis in states, we set up a very strict regulatory framework for dispensaries to legally sell cannabis to customers. This is a very expensive endeavor, and so a dispensary might sell an ounce of cannabis for over $300. But because the black market is so active and cannabis grows readily in outside and indoors, the black market price of cannabis is still lower in most states. In fact, I think across the country it's lower. So I'm seeing prices of less than $200 for a single ounce of cannabis, and over $300 in the black market, and over $300 in the legal dispensary market. So if you're going to, if you find someone in possession of a larger amount of cannabis, in Connecticut, for example, if you find someone purchasing cannabis on the black market, you have to take into account the fact that people who cannot afford to purchase cannabis at dispensaries are going to be more likely to be involved in the black market. And so the justice system skews, as it does in many cases, toward people who have money, toward people who are more established economically. And this is an important distinction because, again, once you charge someone with buying or selling marijuana, once you charge someone with criminal intent in a cannabis case, these federal laws, these mandatory minimum sentences can go into place in their case, and it can be a huge legal battle for them. They can lose their job. They can have their children taken out of their homes. So it's important for law enforcement to understand that the black market cannabis industry is often producing cannabis that is identical to dispensaries. Yes, dispensaries are required to test their cannabis, and so are legal cultivators. But there are legal cultivators out in California who are producing excess cannabis, and that cannabis, even though it's legally produced, it has been tested, it is somehow getting diffused or diverted into the black market. But this doesn't make this cannabis somehow more dangerous. I think it's important for law enforcement to weigh the differences between drugs like alcohol and opiates and other medications that are extremely harmful over cannabis, even if it's black market cannabis, that the related harms are much more diminished for cannabis. And as laws evolve, it's difficult for people to understand or to come up with the money or understand that they may have access to dispensaries when for generations they've been purchasing it from friends and families in their neighborhood. So it's important for me as a social justice cause to remind law enforcement that there are stratas where the legal system and the legal framework for cannabis does not help everyone. So another aspect, and this is where we do have the comfort level of people who have engaged with cannabis, does affect people of higher socioeconomic status, and that is if you're a lawyer, a doctor, a psychotherapist, someone who works for the state or the city, you may not want to be seen in a local dispensary. You may not want to reveal publicly that you consume cannabis because we still have perceptions around it. And if you're someone who sees clients or you're a state worker, you it's a less of a risk for you to purchase cannabis illegally than it is to go into a dispensary and purchase it legally. So these are also scenarios where there are people who just don't have the comfort level to go into dispensaries. And is it illegal to purchase cannabis from the street for someone else? Absolutely, and law enforcement has to do their job to enforce that law, but law enforcement also has discretion. So they have to recognize that, again, because we may have legal dispensaries, this person who's purchased cannabis for the last 20 years from their neighbor who happens to grow it in their home is not diverting it to children, is not harming themselves, is not producing a scenario that is somehow more dangerous than the scenario of purchasing it from the dispensary. The only thing that's lacking is the state getting its tax revenue. It's my opinion that people who are selling their own cannabis that they've produced in their home should just be paying taxes. They should be paying sales tax. They should be testing their cannabis. And these should be part of the regulations so that law enforcement isn't caught in this gray market, this area. Instead, they can walk into a home and see that someone's growing cannabis and say, well, let's see your permit to grow that. Is this commercial cannabis? Is this home use cannabis? If so, I want to see your permit. Do you sell it? If so, let me see your analysis. Do you sell it to dispensaries? Do you sell it to individuals? We have laws in place for things like this, and I believe that eventually we'll get to this place in terms of our society where it can be regulated, but we can also acknowledge that it's very easy to grow a huge amount of cannabis in our homes. If we prevent people from being allowed to legally get rid of that cannabis or sell that cannabis, then it will get diverted in other forms. It will get diverted into places to children that we don't want it. So just to sum up, it's important that we work with law enforcement, but it's also important that law enforcement engages with evolving cannabis use, with evolving cannabis products, and that we engage with the harm that's produced or the lack of harm that's produced. One final thing I forgot to mention is that when someone is growing cannabis or producing cannabis that is intended to sell to people, those customers, a person might have many customers who are using that cannabis for pain relief, for example, and they're purchasing it illegally. Once that person is arrested and they can no longer produce cannabis for these clients who are using it for pain, for example, I believe that these customers are now at risk of seeking out harsher pain medication like opiates or pain meds that may cause more harm to the person or more harm to society or more harm to the children living in that home. So even though it's important to make sure that people are following laws, there is unintended consequences of arresting people and cutting off customers from the supply of cannabis. So I'm not saying that police shouldn't prosecute people who are breaking the law, but it is important for law enforcement to understand that there are many levels and layers to cannabis use, cannabis cultivation. Customers who may not be comfortable buying it through legal routes. And so these people may be using it for reasons that are actually a net benefit to themselves, to the people in their homes, and to the people in their communities, because they're not accessing opiates or pain medication that are more dangerous. So I am an expert witness. I help with cases. I also am happy to talk with law enforcement, talk to towns about how to determine what is the most rational approach to dealing with these laws that overlap in these gray areas. Thank you for joining me. You can find me on EzraHelps.com. Pre-order my book, which comes out next week, called Cannabis Consulting. You can find it on Amazon. Just Just type my name in, Ezra Parzybach. And thanks for joining, and I'll see you next week.